So here we go. And this lecture that she did, this workshop, was the importance of words. She said, words, words, we use them all the time. Oftentimes when we're using words, we don't even know what we're saying because we repeat things, and we don't pay a lot of attention sometimes to things that come out of our mouths. And Louise was commenting, this has got to be 30 years ago, that as children, we were taught grammar, we were taught to select words according to the rules of grammar. However, she said, I always found that the rules of grammar were changing. And as I thought back, that's true. You know, people say things now much differently than they did when I was a kid. And what was improper once upon a time is now okay, and vice versa. And sometimes what is slang in one age, it's now in common use later on. Then she got into the talking about how words affect our lives. You see, she said, I was never taught at school that my choice of words would have anything to do with what my experience of life would be. Commenting that nobody taught me that my thoughts were creative and that my thoughts could literally shape my life. Nobody taught me that what I gave out would return to me. Whatever I was giving out would return to me. Nobody ever taught me that I was worth loving either. Louise grew up in a family that was highly dysfunctional, as most of you know if you've read her life story. She said, nobody ever taught me that I deserved good things or I deserved to have a wonderful life. And nobody taught me that life itself was here for me. As a child, I remember at school, she said we would call each other names, and the names were hurtful sometimes. And I remember back when I was a kid, there was a lot of that going on. I hadn't thought about it in many years. And today in the 2020s, we hear cyberbullying and shaming going on in schools, and it's become an issue, but it always was an issue. I just forgot that it was around. She said she wasn't getting a lot of praise as a child, as she recalls. And today, you know, in the 2020s, parents are busier than ever. You know, kids are, you know, being raised by teachers, it seems. And as a kid, you might recall for yourself, there's pressure in trying to fit in. And that was something that Louise commented upon in that day. You're looking to be okay, and you're looking to be, you're looking for people to give you the nod and all of that. And she said oftentimes we didn't get that even in our own families. And she said, as you look at what we learned from our parents as we're growing up, or the people who raised us, many of us were told repeatedly that we were not good enough, or, you know, some people grew up in families where they were told they're stupid, they're not as smart as their mother, their father, their sister, their brother. And, you know, the ways of being taught that you're not adequate, you know, are just, you know, they're many. And it seems like all of us got a little bit of it, she thought. She said some people got much worse messaging than she did. So I'm thinking today on this broadcast, there's people, you know, that will be listening, hundreds of people through the week. You know, some of you have received messages that you're not okay, or that you were a mistake, or we wish we never had you, and all of that type of stuff. And those are horrendous things to say to a kid, and it's even worse to have it live with you for many, many years. Others on the call might have discovered somewhere in their life that they were adopted, and even if they grew up in a very loving adopted family, you know, there's a scarring, or there's an impact on the child. With any and all of this, children are so receptive to the messaging that went on in the homes. And, you know, it's there and it's buried, Louise Hay thought in many cases. At least it was in her case, because she later had to deal with all of it as an adult. She said, when we don't like thinking about these things, and when any of this commentary was said to us, we kind of like cowered, we shied away, felt hurt when we heard, you know, such words. we didn't realize how deep-seated that pain was. And some of us, Louise included, she said was really mistreated, and you have a tendency to block it and suppress it. It's kind of a way, a defense mechanism for survival, just to try to put it away. There's a lot of us that didn't get consistent positive messaging that we were good or we were important as kids. You weren't told perhaps that you're special and you're smart and you're wonderful. As we became young adults, some of us observed we were judging others, and some of us were saying hurtful things to other people and blaming people. And Louise thought that's a bit of a recreation of what our family was like. It's kind of like learned things. And you don't like to think of yourself as perpetuating that stuff, but if your family environment was all about that type of activity, it's you find yourself doing it, and you go, oh my God, I'm becoming what they were, and stuff like that. And I'm sure many of you have noticed that in yourself, and some of you have worked on yourselves in these classes, and you don't do it anymore, you do it less, or you're more aware. You might notice that you're calling yourself names and you're belittling and berating yourself here and there, and you ask yourself, well, where did that come from? And of course, you already know where it came from. When I was in recovery, they used to call that ground zero, which is in the family dynamics. Too often we accepted these early messages, and then sometimes in families there was what was taught was conditional love. You've heard the phrase before. Conditional love would be maybe like if I were a parent and I said to whoever my child was, hypothetically, I'll love you if you get A's and B's. I'll love you if you grow up and you become whatever. I'll love you if you do this. Now, you might think that's innocent enough, but it's not really great. And some of us got some of that, or I expect you to be, we expect you to be, and so it wasn't really a solicitation from the parent to the child of what the child dreamed to be or wanted to be or anything else. It was more an expectation that the child be a certain way if they were to receive our love and our warmth and our support. So Louise was commenting that acceptance as a child you learned was always according to something else, and that didn't really have anything to do with the child's sense of self-worth. And all this feeds into an inner belief that many of us still have as adults of not feeling quite good enough or adequate. And you don't even know, where it comes from, and sometimes people are having guilt and they're not feeling good about themselves. And Louise would point us to doing some work on our inner self, or some people call it our inner child, because there's messaging that's beneath the surface that perhaps we could unearth so we could finally release. There's a recovery author I used to love, Jacqueline, can't think of her last name. She said, all our battered places need to come to light, because if you're holding on to these places inside of yourself where you still don't feel adequate or good enough and you're critical of yourself, it'd be great if you could kind of like get at them. And when we do journaling, we do spiritual mind treatment, and we exclaim that we're whole and complete and good and we're divine patterns of light and love. When we say those things with heart and passion, oftentimes we will unearth what's buried underneath. And when that happens, it's kind of like striking gold, because you get at whatever it is that's been blocking. And so we do the work. Let's go on to the next thing. She says, these early messages contribute to what I call self-talk. The way we talk to ourselves and the way we talk to ourselves is really important, because it becomes the basis of our spoken word. It sets up the mental atmosphere that we operate in and that attracts us to experiences. Each and every week, I ask the question, what has it been like being you? Paying attention to that conversation is important, and changing it where it's needed is important. Louise said in this series, if we belittle ourselves, life is going to mean very little to us. And if we love and appreciate ourselves, then life can be wonderful. It can be a wonderful experience. It's really up to us, if our life is unhappy, to change it. It's very easy to blame our parents and say it's all their fault. If you haven't dealt with the pattern beneath, then you're probably going to be blaming people, in your adult life. But if we do if we're caught up in blaming people, we stay stuck in our problems. So all these kinds of words will not bring us freedom. If we are finding ourselves to be habitually critical, or we're people who blame a lot, how are we ever going to learn to be empowered, was her question. Remember, our power is in our words. Our power comes from taking responsibility for our lives. And telling ourselves, okay, I can think about this in another way. I could do things differently than I've done them before. I can do this. She commented, I know it sounds scary to be responsible for our lives. Being responsible for our lives sounds different than a person who's habitually blaming and complaining. People who are learning to be responsible somehow, some way, find a way to learn to release the need to blame, complain, and criticize. As you get more involved in this teaching, Louise, incidentally, was involved with this church, First Church in New York. As you get more involved with this teaching, you will learn more profoundly that your thoughts and your thinking, the thoughts you think all day long are creating your life. And the words that you're speaking are constantly creating your future as well. Our thoughts and our beliefs shape our life. So she said, we need to take responsibility for them in the here and now. And we all have family stuff. We were raised by people who passed on a lot of good information, and some that frankly wasn't very helpful at all. But here we are. I remember someone once saying in a class decades ago to me something that stuck. And I remember it, he said, sure, you might have been given a bad deal as a kid, explaining maybe one of you, your life experiences were really terrible as a child, or not the best at least. Maybe some of your family messaging was all about blame and shame. But then he said something I've thought of for many years. He said, even if all of that is true, and some of these terrible family dynamics, you got enough. And I had to think about that a long time, because there's a lot of things in my early childhood that weren't the best, just like in Louise. Louise experienced physical abuse. She experienced sexual abuse. And, she could live her life out complaining of what happened to her, but, she's saying that's not the enlightened way to go. So that person who facilitated that group all those years ago, I remember him saying, you got enough though, Greg, because you got enough love to cause you to, keep staying in the game, keep fighting for yourself. It might have even made you stronger. You got enough to get you to this gathering, to this class. You got enough from your family and maybe from spirit along the way to consider right now, today in this class, how to heal your life, how to expand and grow. Then Louise went on to say, we're all here to go further, to expand. You're here to go past your past, right? You're here to go past where your parents were. Khalil Gibran famously said, we are life's longing for itself. We're the next generation from, the generation we came from. And we're here to go further and express life. And that's a beautiful thought. It's Louise who said, if you really want to be responsible for your life, then you got to start to be responsible for what you say and what you think. The things that we say are extensions of our thoughts. What is the first thing you say to yourself in the morning? You hear this said in many talks. What's the first thing? What's the second thing? What's the third thing? Most people more or less say the same thing every day. And here's the question. Is it good morning life with a smile on your face and exuberant enthusiasm? Or is it, oh God, it's morning, as the alarm clock goes off? You can start it off with excitement, or you can start it off with a grumble. And then as you wind down the day, hopefully you're finding ways to wind it down in peace and harmony, right? What's the last thought you think at night before you go to bed? These are important too, because these thoughts can shape your future as well. You can do affirmations before you go to sleep, right? You can do affirmations or prayers, affirmative prayer. You can also tune into, with YouTube today, a dark screen, and there's healing meditations of all kinds that you can bask in their positive messages as you drift off. There's all kinds of ways you can do it. Please, Louise said, don't bring your worries to bed with you. Please find ways to go to sleep that are nurturing. Instead of counting sheep, maybe you can drift off counting your blessings, or remember what you're grateful for. I used to try counting sheep. What if you tried counting the things that you're grateful for and slumber off with that? I'm sure your dreams will probably take on a different form. She next said, when I first heard that I could change my life, I was at First Church here in New York. I was told I can change my life if I was willing to change my thinking. And that was quite a revolutionary idea. She says this was in New York City when I first discovered the Church of Religious Science, which is who we are. She said they were the very first people that told me that. And even though I didn't understand all of it, it rang a bell. There's something about it that rang true. It really touched me. That place within me of intuition. And she says, I've always learned, I've dedicated myself to trying to follow that intuition. And we're all inlets and outlets of this energy, this cosmic stuff, that which some of you want to call God. But wherever you are in the planet or the world, we're all part of it. And she wanted to learn to trust it more. Louise, speaking of First Church, said, they're right. And then began getting more involved here at First Church and in the adventure of learning how to change her thinking. So she said, you get the idea, you hear it first in the classes, and you say yes. And then you want to go through, how am I going to do it? And I want to do it quickly, and how do I get there? And she said, well, I was studying and taking classes at First Church. She said she also did a lot of reading, because we have a lot of books. I could give you a list. The most important thing, though, is to stay with it. Stay in the conversation as often as you can, once or twice a week. But she wanted more, and she read more, and she got involved in the classes. And after 3 years of taking classes here, she began teaching the material herself. She said at first it was sort of easy. And she said, I grasped the concepts quickly, and I started to think and talk a little bit differently. And she said, I noticed I was no longer complaining quite as much. She said, I was a great complainer. I grew up in a critical family, and I was very critical, and I was a great complainer. And then I was also pretty good at self-pity in those days. So this was, she's being very brutally honest with everybody. She said, I didn't know that all the time I was doing that, I was creating more and more experiences to pity myself over. I didn't realize in those days that wherever you are in life, no matter what's happening, you're always doing the best you can with the information and the understanding and the awareness that you have. So she said, I wasn't teaching that yet because I didn't realize it yet. And she says, and I didn't realize as you know more, you'll do it differently. So she pleaded with her audience that day, please, please, never berate yourself for where you are Just stop. Say to yourself you're doing the best you can, and say that there is a solution. So let's find out what's the best way to go forward. And see, that's the conversation you have with yourself. You wouldn't be critical of yourself. You say, okay, self, okay, here we go again, we blew it, whatever, but let's find the way to move forward, you and I. So let's find out the best way to do it. Jimmy? Because if all you do is tell yourself that you're stupid, then you stay stuck. You need loving support if you want to make changes. I started to watch some of what I said, and I became aware of my self-criticism, and I tried to stop. And I began to babble affirmations without quite knowing what they meant. And a few small changes began to take place. And I started with the easy ones, of course. She says, I immediately started getting parking spaces, and driving my car, I would get green lights. And she said, I thought I was hot stuff. Oh, wow. I'm demonstrating all of these things. And she said, very soon I got a little bit cocky and arrogant and dogmatic in my beliefs. And she says, I had a sense I had all the answers. But it was my way of feeling safe in this new area that I was moving through. Because when you start to move away from some of your old rigid beliefs, especially when you've been in control for a long time in order to feel safe, it's very scary to move out and start trusting an affirmation, trusting your affirmations. Though that's going through your mind and you're trusting in it to change your life, it's still a scary time. She said, I was grasping onto new ideas and new things, and it was a beginning. It was a beginning for me. But she said, I had a long way to go still. Like most of us, she said, I didn't find the pathway always easy and smooth, because just saying affirmations isn't really enough. You've got to believe in them. You've got to practice them, right? And she said, I couldn't understand what I was doing wrong. So she had this thing where, what am I doing wrong? She said that was one of my favorite things, and it was defeating. I remember my teacher at the time used to mention that I had some resentments, and she said I didn't have the faintest idea what he was talking about. And she said, surely I don't have any resentments, not me. I'm on the pathway, I don't have any resentments. And she said, I know I'm whole and complete and spiritually perfect. And went on to say, but as I continued with my life and continuing doing the best I could, as I studied metaphysics and spirituality, she said, I began to grasp, and as I started to apply it, she said, I started to see things. We don't always see things in the beginning. And she said, time goes by very quickly. I was teaching the science of mind. I had become a practitioner. And I wondered then why my students seemed to be stuck, and why my students were stuck in their problems. She said, I gave them so much good advice. Why weren't they using it? Why weren't they living it? She said, it never dawned on me that I was talking the truth myself more than I was living it. See, that's the thing. It's sort of like being a parent that tells you what to do, and then does the exact opposite of what they say. And then one day, somewhere out of the blue, she said, I became diagnosed. And that was a very scary word at the time. It was a scary word even now. I've experienced it myself. She said, I was diagnosed with cancer, and I knew too much by then to hide from myself. I knew that cancer was a disease of resentment that literally is held for a long time until it eats away at the body. And went on to say, you see, when we stuff things down inside of us, it has to go somewhere. And if we spend a lifetime of stuffing things down, it's going to manifest at some point somewhere. And of course, she said, I became very aware then what resentment within me could be about. She went into her story of a childhood, and she remembered how badly she had been abused. And of course she had resentments, and these resentments were stuffed down. So one of the questions for tonight for everybody is, if there's stuff that's deep within you that is holding you back, you might want to start being open to learning what you need to learn, because when it's buried, it doesn't necessarily mean it's been dealt with. And Louise went on to say, of course I had resentments, and of course I was bitter and unforgiving. And she said, I had never done any work to change or release any of it before. When I left home, it was all I could do to just no longer think of that stuff and try to put it behind me. And she said, when I found myself on this spiritual pathway in religious science, she says, I covered my feelings up with whatever was down there, I covered up with a nice layer of spirituality. And I put such a wall around myself, I literally was totally out of touch with my feelings about any of that. I didn't know who I was, or what happened or whatever, but after my diagnosis, my inner work of beginning to get to know myself really began. At that point, she said, thank God I had tools that I learned in religious science, tools to work with, because I know what the panic is when someone's diagnosed with such an illness. She said, but I had guidance, I had tools, and I knew that I needed to go within. If anybody was going to make any permanent changes, she said it had to be me. She said the doctor could give me an operation and perhaps take care of, the tumor, but if I didn't change what was going on inside of me, the pattern within me, if I didn't change the way I was using my thoughts and my words, I'd most likely recreate it again. So at that point, Louise dug deep. She got much more serious with the teaching. She was no longer content to just do affirmative prayer and demonstrate parking spaces or get green lights while she's driving. She knew she needed to heal her life. She said, I knew that I needed to go much deeper, and I realized that I was not really progressing in my life the way I could or the way I wanted, because I hadn't really cleared out the old garbage from my childhood, and I wasn't yet living what I was teaching. And that's true of a lot of people in religious science. We do know this stuff. We learn it, right? But then, it comes to practice. I've had students myself. I remember very well when I was living down south, I had a person who was in our center who said, well, I took these classes 16 years ago. And she was a miserable person, and she always told me she took all the classes. And I remember offering, I said, we'll sponsor you, take them again. Because the thing is, your consciousness is in the here and now. It's like, I might have taken a class, I've taken the Science of Mind series classes several times, right? And every time I take them, I'm in a different place, or I'll find that I've forgotten a lot, so Louise knew that she had, as much as she knew when she was teaching this stuff, she's becoming a bit of a sensation. As much as she knew that she knew this stuff, she said, I wasn't really practicing it as much as I could. Thank God I had the tools and the information. And she said, I began a program of self-healing in earnest. I really put the pedal to the metal. One of the first things she said, I remember, I began studying and reading everything I could, in addition to Science of Mind, about alternative ways to deal with cancer. She said, I truly believed I could heal my life, and she says, I was about to prove it to myself and anybody else. And so she embarked on nutritional improvements and did her affirmations, her visualizations, her spiritual mind treatments. She said, I worked in every way I could with religious science because I was determined to heal my body, heal my life. She also said, I went to a really good therapist for a while who was skilled in helping people express and release any hidden anger. And she says, I worked on it, and he was good, and I was good, and I was willing. I beat some pillows. I did whatever I could. I wanted to have that stuff, pulled right out of me. And she says, this felt so good. She says, never in my life had I given myself permission to do anything like that. She was always going to be the glamorous, beautiful, good girl. And that isn't necessarily healing if you've got a bunch of stuff within you. And she said, I worked on understanding myself, and I had to do a lot of work on forgiveness of the people in my life, forgiveness for myself also. she said, no matter what avenue of spirituality anybody's in, and she, of course, at that point was receiving people from every religion, she says forgiveness is going to be a good part of anyone's healing journey. Forgiveness of self, forgiveness of family, forgiveness of, it's going to be different for everybody. But forgiveness is going to be probably a cornerstone of anyone's spiritual growth. She said, most importantly, when there's an illness, when we're ill, we need to look around and see who we need to forgive. And it's usually, she said, the very person we think that we will never forgive. But of course, not forgiving someone doesn't harm them in the slightest. But it plays havoc with us. It plays havoc with us because the issues are not theirs. The issues are ours. So one of the things I did, she said, was I explored my parents' childhood as much as I could, and I began to understand where they were coming from, and I realized that where they were coming from and how they had been brought up. She said, I realized they couldn't really have done much different than what they did. They were brought up in abuse, and they continued it, and nobody taught them another way. It was their way of life. She said, but my growing understanding enabled me to start the forgiveness process. If you're walking down the street and somebody bumps into you and you whip around, you're very angry. How dare they do that? And then you see that the person is blind. The understanding that you have instantly dissolves the anger that you had. And you think that when I can really begin to understand that the childhood of the people who have done us wrong, it enables us to almost go beyond forgiveness and into understanding so that we can open the doors to our own heart and compassion. You see, people who have problems loving themselves are always people who are not willing to forgive, because non-forgiveness shuts the door. And when you forgive and when you let go, not only does a huge weight drop over your shoulders, but the doorway to your own self-love opens up.